I am very pleased to have on the Plone Podcast the eminent scholar and code warrior, Steve McMahon, who is the author, among many other things, of Plone Forumjen, the Unified Installer, the Ansible Playbook, a longtime board member, and infamous Sprint Meister.
Thank you, Kim.
And Steve was also a keynoter at Plone Symposium Midwest in 2014, which I was very pleased to be able to organize. And he gave a great keynote, drew on sociology, his background in sociology, and gave a wonderful talk on the origins of open source software. So Steve, thanks for joining me on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. I should add to that introduction that I actually didn't create the original Unified Installer. That was Kamal Gill, who at that time was also from the Davis area, who hasn't been in the Plone community for a good while, but I took it over from him and ran with it for many more years.
You did. All right. Well, thanks for clarifying that. It's great to see that so many things in Plone were started by one person or a group of people and then passed off to another and another. I don't know, I guess depending on the thing in Plone, we've kind of had multiple generations of developers working on things.
It's really true. And that is the sign of a great project, that's happening. Yeah. And it appears to be staying very lively. I'm mostly retired right now and have not been really keeping up. I still monitor Plone communications just to have a feel for what's happening and cheer on the community. But I haven't been following beta releases or anything of that sort, but it looks very exciting.
Yeah, 20 years. We've been in business for, the business of giving away things for 20 years. And Plone 6 coming soon this year with the Volto front end. That is definitely driving a lot of change. Yeah. This week I was drafting a blog post about Plone deployment. Some of the changes in Plone deployment. And first now, well, I guess one big thing is pip install, pip install Plone, and the Docker images for Plone. It's really changed the way you would want to deploy Plone.
Right. Those were ambitions for a long time that have finally come true.
So Steve, tell me from the depths of, from the far off, wonderful explored lands, or maybe unexplored lands of retirement, what wisdom would you bring back to us who are still toiling away in the fields, the enclosed fields?
Well, I guess the biggest thing is retirement's great. I know it may not be exactly the same for everyone, but I really encourage it, and don't wait too long to do it. Among other things, because there's a good reason why people retire at a certain age and things start happening to you. Ooh. And to spouses and friends. I mean, life changes, and you have a lot more health stuff going on than you did before. In my case, taking care of elderly parents. Those things eat up a lot of time, and it's good not to have the daily demands of work while you're doing that. And then it's also great to have vacations and to take naps on weekdays.
I remember talking to you many times over the years about some of the ways that your choice of career gave you more freedom to do a lot of those things. I mean, I'm assuming you didn't nap that much during your work days, but definitely being able to control your schedule and be able to accept that, yeah, it's okay if I don't work like a dog. I'm okay with that. Yeah. And that's definitely one of the things I was a bit jealous of you for.
I think the biggest thing for me was that I always combined my work with a pretty hefty amount of volunteer work. It was really probably half and half over my work career. And that was in part made possible by having a working spouse with good benefits. But that was great, and there was a lot of synergy in it. The Plone work was volunteer work. I worked on local commissions. I worked with a community network for many years, and a lot of those things fit together.
I was going to ask you to explain to our listeners or viewers more about the Davis Community Network.
Yeah, so the Davis DCN, the Davis Community Network, is now largely defunct, but for over 20 years, it was just a leader in local communications in the Davis area. It was the first non-university internet service provider in all of Northern California. It might have been all of California, for all I know. It went from initially just providing connectivity to providing local content. Then it became a home for well over 100 local and regional organizations. We provided them with an avenue for easily creating websites through Plone, of course. They didn't know it, but it was Plone. And then later on, it transitioned into becoming an advocate for creating better connectivity locally. We tried unsuccessfully to get the local community interested in a fiber network. And that was the big failure of my last few years. The city government didn't bite.
It's okay if you don't want to talk about it more, but I'm interested if commercial providers had any effect on the outcome of that.
Well, for Europeans, this is going to sound very strange, but we only essentially had one reliable local internet provider, which was Comcast, a cable company that provided very unsatisfactory and continues to provide very unsatisfactory internet connectivity in the area. Operated as a monopoly at very high charges with a mediocre product. But they're an incumbent, and they already had a tremendous investment, and they had tremendous political power. And they made it very clear that if we were to try and establish a local network, they would do anything to prevent that from succeeding. And this was also the time we were really trying to do this was about the time that the US government was backing off of an interest in local connectivity. I don't know if you remember this. During the Trump era, we had a very conservative Federal Communications Commission that would have outlawed local networks if they could have, municipal networks. They made it much more difficult. And that was all a climate in which it was hard to make things happen.
I know connectivity has been an even bigger issue in the time of COVID because so many people have had to retreat from working in the office or going into schools. Kids are studying from home. Hopefully, it won't continue as badly as before, but I know that in Wisconsin here, there's been a push, I think in the state legislature. In fact, I think it may have already passed that if you're selling a house, you have to declare the kind of network connectivity you have. There's still ways that things can fall through the cracks, but at least now people are aware, government is aware that it's such an important aspect of buying a place or living.
Right. And you shouldn't get the horror stories of people buying a house and then discovering that there's, nothing faster than 384K connectivity.
It's hard to zoom on that slow connection.
Yes.
Maybe somewhat more encouraging is that I've been seeing over the last few years anyway, articles. I read a lot of Ars Technica, and on Ars Technica, there's been a lot of articles about rural communities getting together and finding ways of creating their own internet provider. Right. And then almost to the point where it seems like some of them have created a kind of roadmap with all the checklists you need and contact to all the different equipment providers, so you can almost roll your own.
Right, and there are great federal subsidies for rural areas too that don't exist for university towns. But yeah, there are a lot of experimentation in rural areas, and they desperately need it. I mean, if you're in a rural area and have no high-speed connectivity, that's going to really limit you.
So all this work that you did in the Davis, did you help create the DCN, the Davis Community Network?
It had already been established in its first life as an internet connectivity provider when we moved to Davis in the mid 90s. And I joined soon afterwards. And I was always much more interested in content and web services, as you might imagine. I'm not really a hardware guy.
Did you start using Zope? Is that how you got onto the?
Yeah. And I hoped we would get around to talking to that when I first got interested in Zope after meeting some people at a Python meetup. And was talking about interest in the web, and they said, you've got to go take a look at this project. And I did, and it was fantastic. And I had this interest in providing content management for local community organizations, and Zope was a way to do it. And like any number of people at that time, I rolled my own CMS out of Zope. There was a lot of that going on then. Plone was much better.
So I think at some point, maybe at one of those Plone symposia at Penn State, I think you revealed that you had written, is it election type software around it, or was it like election results? No?
So it's actually Plone-based election reporting. My last client, this is why I'm semi-retired. I have one client left, and that's the YOLO Elections Office. Mm-hmm. And I've been very proud of my work with them. That originally began with Zope and then moved on to Plone. And it's, in addition to just providing web reporting on everything they do, we had election night reporting. And as far as I know, we were absolutely the first web reporting of election results in California, this little, mostly rural county.
That's very cool.
Yeah. And so this was just, doing Zope and Plone add-ons that would parse files output by the election tallying apparatus and create web pages out of them.
Wow. What year did you start doing that?
Oh, I think it was in the 90s somewhere. So that's gone on for a long time. It's still going on. Come June, I'll be doing it for the gubernatorial primary.
Wow. Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah, it's a fun project.
On the back end, what sort of output are they putting out? Just CSV files or something like that?
So on the back right, and they've had a variety of formats over the years. It originally started just parsing report files, human readable report files, and then moved into eventually being comma separated values files. And so they dump a file, ship it to me. I'm typically there on election night, and they'll hand me a USB key because the telling machine is not connected to the internet.
Yes, good.
Yeah, everybody should know that the tallying machines are not connected to the internet. And so we take a file, take it over, and then initially it would take that file and write out static web pages. But then later on, when I got a lot better at figuring out caching and such, they were just Plone pages.
Mm. Wow, that's fun.
And caching was very important because that website would get more activity than the whole rest of the year in one night.
I was going to say, maybe this is not for this audience, but I mean, I'm kind of interested to hear a little bit more about your caching strategies, but maybe we could.
Oh, it's nothing exotic. It's just, I mean, for Plone, it's just what people do with I learned how to get reasonably good with high traffic sites. I actually got good at that in part from another project I worked with, the Washington Trails Association.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think we inherited from 6 Feet Up, who inherited it in turn from, what was John Stahl's outfit? Groundwire. Yeah, yes. From Groundwire. And they were a huge and wonderful site, and they're still running strong.
Yes, I think Jaskarta has been the most recent maintainer. Yeah.
Yep. They'd been doing the programming for a while, and then when I retired, they took over the web hosting.
So the caching strategy is really, yeah, I was going to say election websites. I mean, they can just get hammered.
Oh yeah. Yep. I mean, the Yolo County is not a huge county, but local politics are intense. And Davis is a university town, and its local politics are intense. And people will be sitting at candidate election parties, literally hitting the refresh button every few seconds, looking for updated results. And so you don't want to be, yeah, you don't want to be generating a new Plone page every time you get a hit.
Right, right. You
can do a lot very easily, though. If you cache a page for even 30 seconds, you handle a lot.
It makes me think that maybe notifications would be fun to enable somehow, to push notifications to mobile devices, because a lot of people are, I assume most people are viewing these results on mobile devices.
Right. We towards the end, we were using Twitter to let people know there'd been an update, and the updates were infrequent enough that it didn't need to be automated. Always good to know what doesn't need to be automated.
Yes. When you mentioned before that you went to a Python meetup, and that's where you discovered or you learned of Zope. Do you remember, was it anybody that we would know who maybe put you onto Zope?
I can't remember in particular. David Seaband might have been there. I mean, I don't know if he's still active, but he was a member of the foundation for a while from our area. I think I met Kamal Gill later on. And then met a lot more people as time went on. But locally, it was just, it was just some university people who were using Python a lot.
That's cool. Speaking of meeting people, I always like to use the podcast as an opportunity to remember how I met a certain person. And in your case, it was at the DC conference. No, you know what? I think it was 2008. Yeah, it was DC. And I'd been using Plone for maybe 5 years or something like that. But of course, Plone Forumjen being included in the unified installer build out file, I mean, everybody was using it. And I remember sitting at a dinner table, probably the first evening we were there, and it was a fairly large table, and we just went around the table and we were just saying each other's names, and then got to you. I think you were sitting at the far end of the table and said, "Oh, I'm Steve McMahon." And it was just like, oh my God, that's the guy. And he's such a nice guy.
Well, thank you.
Little did I know.
Right. And then word got around.
I know.
Yeah, Plone Forumjen was a lot of fun. I was very proud of the work on that add-on. I think the idea for it came of one of our initial Zope Plone user group meetings in Davis.
Somebody just put a bug in your head and you just kind of said, I think I could do something?
Well, I think since I worked with a lot of community organizations and small websites, I knew they needed forms. And so I think that I brought up the topic of how to do forms. And then maybe a couple of meetings later, I said, I think I figured out how to use the archetypes framework to do ad hoc forms. And people liked the idea. And it was definitely the most popular add-on for Plone for a good while.
It's definitely a game changer. I mean, I don't know one of the things I did at the university here in Oshkosh was I discovered how Plone Forumjen and this other add-on called Workflow Manager could be combined to be kind of a killer business process workflow for forms package. And man, did we ever roll out tons of huge Plone Forumjen forms on campus.
Right.
And it was great because people could just be shown how to build a form and then off they were to the races.
Yeah. One of the things I'm most proud of about Plone Forumjen is that really from the very beginning of it, it was meant to be practical. And that meant being very careful about making changes in the way it operated and working really hard to make every version backward compatible with what came so that we didn't strand people when we updated it. And I think the result of that was people really relied on it. And indeed, there were sites with hundreds of forms on them. So some of those people have undoubtedly cursed the whole thing since, when it didn't make the transition to Python 3 and Plone 5.2 and upward.
Yeah, yeah.
But it had a long run, so I don't feel too guilty.
Oh, there's no reason for you to feel guilty, but it's definitely true that the switch to Plone 5.2 and collective easy form has been not as smooth. I know Philip Bauer created, or maybe he created, but he's been adding to migration code that helps recreate easy forms from Plone Forumjen.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's this ongoing, not much of a debate, but just this question, like, shouldn't Plone Forumjen just be part of Plone Core?
Yeah. And I think it's good it wasn't. If I'd been run over by a bus, it might have been more of a problem, although it was always on GitHub and the collective was always available. But the being free of the core also allowed it to have its own versioning. And, there were probably several versions that were inside Plone 2.5 that were done. And if it had been part of the core, it would have had to wait. Not to mention, it would have tackled the Plone 5.1 to Plone 5.2 transition with a huge problem.
Extra work, that's true.
Yeah. I had hoped that there would be migration code, and I worked with a Google Summer of Code student on it, but it just never matured. Too many little problems to solve.
It's interesting, Steve, that you mentioned how you took great care in thinking about the long-term use of Plone Forumjen. I don't think that that's limited to what you did for, that what you did in that respect wasn't limited to Plone Forumjen. You've always taken a long view of things. And so I know I was introduced to Ansible thanks to your work with the Ansible playbook for Plone. Repeatable deployments, that's something that people talk about now. It's a mantra for developer, or for operators or deployers. But you're the person who introduced it to me.
Yeah. And I learned it from other Plone folks. I hate to think that I'm blanking of their names, but I think Tom and Andy in Berlin.
Tom Lazar?
Yes, Tom Lazar.
And Andy, oh, darn it.
I know I'd hate to blank on them, but yeah, they'd found it and really liked it and heard about it. And I saw a real opportunity to put Plone in a box, if you will. And that worked.
Plone in a box.
Well, just to be able to basically push a button and get a deployment out of it. Right.
I'm chuckling because I did a thing that is kind of I called it Plone in a box just kind of as a joke, but it's Amazon Machine Images and Linode stack scripts and DigitalOcean. I can't remember what they call them, but the thing that I was going to get at, though, is that the way that you've approached software, your methodical long-term approach to it, is really interesting, because computer software or software isn't your background, right?
It's true. I'm a sociologist by training.
So is that, I know in your keynote, certainly at Plone Symposium Midwest, your background really informs understanding of open source and open source software projects. But how does it affect the way that you think about software? Like, how did you encounter software? How did you get hooked on software?
So I have been working with computers since probably 1973. I have worked with punch cards and Fortran 4. My first computer programming was Fortran 4 with punch cards on a timeshare IBM 360 that was 3 hours drive away. And then I learned, I think, Pascal and APL in college, took up Perl Afterwards, learned Modula 2, which I wrote commercial software for newspaper classified advertising in. And so I don't know if it was because of the social science interest, but I was in a generation that had to learn software engineering on its own. There were no software engineering courses in college at that point in time. And I was interested in it, and I took it pretty seriously. And for example, my interest in Modula 2 came all out of software engineering. It was just a beautiful language, really engineered for large projects.
I guess I haven't seen Modula 2. I haven't looked at it in detail, but it was interesting that you built a classified ad system using it.
Yeah, this is also organic. My parents were in the newspaper business, and I grew up in a small newspaper family. And by small, I mean circulation 5,000 size, county seat weeklies in the Western United States, and then dailies. And so I knew the business. And when I was in graduate school in sociology and began to get frustrated with spending months writing one paper to be read by one person. You've seen people go through that. The writing software that would be enthusiastically embraced by others was very attractive. And that's where I started working on the newspaper classified stuff. And originally wrote it in, I think it may have originally been written in Structured Basic, and then Pascal, and then Modula 2. And by the way, Modula 2 was one of the languages that influenced Guido in the creation of Python. There are all sorts of little Modula 2 features in it.
Okay. I did not know that.
Right. The way we begin every Python program, import blank. The first programming language in which that was popularly used was Modula 2. And then there was a structured Pascal that was based on the features of Modula 2 that made use of that feature. But before that point in time, the whole namespace was present all the time in the computer languages, the popular computer languages.
It's funny because that whole import, I guess, trying to think, maybe I used UCSD Pascal a long time ago, but I don't remember if it had import statements.
I think it did. I think it may have been one of the first. And that was inherited from early versions of Modula 2. I'm not absolutely sure of that. It's been a long time.
I'm just chuckling too, because when you mentioned APL and then Perl, God, yes. There's a lot of Perl haters out in the Python community.
Well, for good reason. I actually wrote a lot of Perl at one point, and I do not hate Perl, but you know what PERL stands for, don't you?
No, I forgot.
Pathologically eclectic rubbish lister.
No way.
Yeah. So Perl was, Larry Wall was the creator of Perl, right? And he was as I say, when I grew up in this business, nobody had a computer science background except the people who hung out at Berkeley. And so Larry Wall was a linguist, and Perl was meant to emulate natural languages. It was meant to be extremely expressive. And that's the pathologically eclectic part. And the motto of Perl is there's more than one way to do it. And there is always more than one way to do it in Perl. And Perl is wonderful for writing essentially reports. And it was a great early language for the web. But you realize at a certain point that Perl, like APL, is a write-only language. Which is to say, it's not meant to be read. And one of the things I've always known about myself is that I will write a piece of code and then put it away for a few months before I work on maintaining it again. And I wrote Perl that I looked at again 3 and 6 months later, and it was cryptic and unmaintainable. And that was Python's fantastic attraction to me. Python was meant to be readable and maintainable. a great language and a great culture.
I've been noticing a lot more features that are being added to Python that just remind me of features that are in other languages. So like Python 3.10, I'm forgetting now which specific feature, but it just seems to me like languages are converging or have. It's just I find it's hard for me to get excited about new features in Python because I've already seen them before.
Yeah, right. I mean, these days, nobody works in just one language for any period of time. I mean, even a few years ago, you had to be working in both Python and JavaScript and no CSS and maybe XSLT. Yeah, people pull stuff from everywhere.
But I guess that's a good sign. It means that they're learning from previous exploration or previous understanding of features and
they want stuff. I mean, when you've got a good built-in dictionary data type, you don't want to have to recreate that.
I'm seeing JavaScript adding type notations and like, okay, it's.
Yeah, JavaScript was not as privileged a language as Python. It had to learn it the hard way. Didn't have the great initial design.
I want to go back to something I in my introduction that you were a wonderful sprint meister. I remember noticing at the Plone Symposium Midwest, or not, no, sorry, Plone Symposium East at Penn State, that you were just a natural convener of people, and you were so calm and encouraging. You're like a perfect mentor.
Oh, thank you.
Really, you are, and well, I mean. Taken to the extreme, you're a recruiter and an enabler of future community members. So it's just great to see that your way of approaching getting people on board onto a thing and getting them involved, that's part of what I see as the strength of the Plone community, that those sprints are I can't remember now if really Plone came up with the idea or if it was Python.
Zope did.
Zope, yeah.
And Zope absolutely invented it. I mean, the term sprint came out of the Zope culture. And yeah, I hope I was a good sprint master when I did it, but I didn't come up with any of the ideas for that. That was all part of our culture from the very beginning. And I think a key part of the culture too. The sprints were where we communicated how the software was actually written.
I think it was at one of those Plone Symposium East sprints that the Plone community was just thinking about switching over to Git and GitHub. And I remember maybe it was a presentation at one of those, or during the sprint, just to like, hey, everybody gather around. Let's take a look at how this might work. We were switching over from Subversion.
Yeah.
But that's really, I think the way that you help grow the Plone community and the way you welcome new members to the Plone community, that's something that is certainly the reason why I got involved and then stayed involved and wanted to emulate a lot of what you were doing. That ethos, I think, is really what sets apart, hopefully Plone, but maybe just open source in general.
I think Plone is a shining example inside open source, which is in turn a shining example of how to do this. And, once again, I learned from the best. I mean, people like Alex Leamy and Joel Burton. I mean, Joel Burton's influence on our culture was incredible. I see Joel on Facebook these days, but otherwise not. I know he's continues to be a fantastic educator.
Yeah, Joel is a remarkable human being. Now I'm remembering the stickers that we had in San Francisco where I met Joel Burton.
Yes, right. For those for whom that's a cryptic reference, Joel, who was really one of our great founding figures, not a founder of the initial project, but the whole culture, had been inactive from Plone for a few years. And when we had the conference in San Francisco, everybody hoped and was planning for Joel to show up. And the organizers created stickers. I met Joel Burton.
That's right. And yeah, it was Trish Ong had created that sticker, or I think all the stickers, and then that particular sticker set she gave only to Joel. So you really had to meet Joel, and he could hand out that sticker.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah, speaking of Joel as being one of the sort of founders of our culture, and recollecting the history of the project, the role of IRC, Internet Relay Chat, in the early years, it was just huge. That was our communications mechanism. And for those who weren't around during that period of time, I mean, it was this just global chat room shared by the world for Plone. And people would sign on. And Joel was just this fantastic figure in it. He would come online and tutor people in Plone development for 2-3 hours in a row.
I remember at one of the conferences, I think in between talks, he would be reading IRC and then responding in IRC and helping somebody in there while at the same time answering questions in person and helping those people.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe he was doing that.
Yeah. I mean, IRC was the heartbeat of Plone in those days, many years ago. And I think Joel really built the positive culture that was present there. And it was very positive. People did tremendous amounts of helping one another. And I don't think we or anybody else has that kind of interactivity any longer, in part because the desperation isn't there. The desperation to learn these things in that period of time when there were so few sources, that you would go to the effort of trying to figure out how to use IRC, which God knows had a hostile interface, in order to just get simple questions answered.
I remember being in an IRC quite a bit, and then just some of the newer tools that have become available since have made IRC less relevant, unfortunately.
Yeah, Slack, for example. And it was, IRC, it was great for its time, but the user interface was always terrible. And it's, sort of good riddance in that respect, but it was a fascinating part of the early culture of open source software that I don't think it was just Plone for whom IRC was where the culture of a project was born.
I know there's still projects, a lot of big projects that still use IRC, although I mean, recent controversies and Freenode, for example, have caused people to switch away.
Yeah, the controversies will always be with us.
What was that you said about Battlestar Galactica?
All this has happened before.
Yes.
And will happen again.
Yes. Very true. You and I had exchanged a couple of ideas before what we might want to discuss, and you thought you wanted to bring up the BSD versus GNU, the GPL licensing issues in deciding how Plone would be licensed.
I just think it's sort of a fascinating part of the history of a project. Licensing is important, and I think it's easy to come to a project and not realize how important licensing is for the code. And having a foundation to own the code is very important. And one of the things, the first boards of directors of the Plone Foundation were the people who built with building the foundation in the first place. But the subsequent boards had to make it work and to figure out things like licensing and to deal with controversies over licensing and deal with controversies like that. We had a GPL2 license while an awful lot of the rest of open source had BSD style licenses at that point, much more freewheeling licenses. But licenses have impacts and they build cultures. And I think the GNU license helped build our culture.
I have to admit that the details of the licensing have not been something that I paid a huge amount of attention to. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you saw GPL ending up causing Plone to end up differently than had it followed a BSD license?
Well, the GNU public license encourages, in fact, it makes it mandatory, but it also encourages giving back. And since, any extra work you do on the code, if it's going to go out there at all, it has to go back. It has to become available again. I think it works for projects staying together as communities. And it militates against forking of code, against projects endlessly forking. And one of the early challenges that I think Plone could have faced was forking, was people trying to fork off the project. And there were some, many years ago, there were some people who tried to do it. They tried to create custom versions of Plone that had privatized elements to them. And they really wanted Plone to change its licensing to a license that would allow forking more easily. And I think it was a key decision for our community that we stuck with GPL2 and tried to keep the community together. Who knows, maybe Plone would own the world, or forks of Plone would own the world otherwise.
Yeah, some fork, yeah.
But it helped build our culture that we were not endlessly forking.
I think I'm remembering one particular project, maybe 2006, 2007, that had done something like that. They just copied the Plone source and then started modifying the innards. They even went to the quite great lengths to create I think it was a Flash desktop app that made Plone. It gave it a nice UI. It was certainly powerful in that respect. But yeah, the fact that it wasn't done the way we would normally have wanted it done meant that we just couldn't proceed with endorsing it or helping them.
Right, and they were actually requiring that people put badges on their websites, attributing it to them, as well as, of course, selling. So they did some great work. It's really too bad that they did that work and it stayed isolated from the project. Not remembering the details necessarily, but I think they were among the encouragers to move towards GPL3, which would have, in theory, allowed more of this. And we decided to stick with GPL2, basically in order to try and keep contributions in the code stream, keep them under the same culture.
Steve, what years were you on the board?
Oh, I really should have looked before we got together to talk.
If only we had a website where we could look that up, huh? With good built-in search.
Yeah, certainly the mid 2000s would basically be the years, early and mid 2000s. And there was a time when I had been on the board longer than anyone. I'm quite sure that I've since been displaced by people like yourself and Paul and Chrissy.
Paul.
Yeah.
The new BDFL.
Yep. Very benevolent.
Yes. Wonderfully benevolent.
We were very, very lucky. We've been very, very, very lucky to have Paul. To have Paul as a friend as well as one of the key people in Plone.
When you got involved in the Plone Foundation, on the board, who recruited you?
Joel Burton and Alex Leamy.
Okay.
And ironically, I had never been to a Plone conference when I first ran for and was elected to the board. Although I tried to go, things had come up to keep me away. And it was one of the Plone conferences in Italy, I ran. And I think, again, it's been many years, but I think Joel and Alex endorsed me. And that was all it took at that point in time.
That must have been Naples then, 2007?
I think it was Naples, yeah. And we actually had several new people come on the board at that time, including John Stahl and Darcy Hanning. And of course, John had a great history with Plone too.
Yes, yeah. Some of the things you had been using when you started using Zope, who were some of the people you worked with or learned from when you were building your Zope sites?
Boy, I was a lone eagle at that point in time. I read the code and I wrote the software, and in part it was because I I'd come to this new and I felt so junior apprentice, must not trouble the masters. So it was really Plone that introduced me to open source culture. I was just a consumer early on for Zope, though I subscribed to the mailing lists. And I saw the first email from Alan and Alex trying to talk Zope into going with Plone for its content management system, which caused a lot of controversy and did not succeed.
That's funny. Isn't it great that?
Sorry.
Isn't it great that Zope is now part of the Plone Foundation?
Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, not only is that a natural fit, but it's such a great thing that the Plone Foundation has become something of an umbrella organization for good projects.
Yeah.
You know, on a smaller level than the Apache Foundation, obviously, but a really positive thing. And Zope was just a natural fit. And I'm so happy that the work that everybody did in the creating the Plone Foundation has paid off in that way, really leveraged it.
That was really very forward thinking, because at the time I was going, oh, that's interesting. You know, it's like, but now when you hear about projects just kind of disappearing or just not being protected by licensing or proper, I guess, management of what's going on in their project, it's amazing that Plone was one of the first big software foundations.
Yeah, we have Paul Everett to thank for that, and I think in largest part. And I think John Stahl was involved too, but I think Paul Everett was the one who really had the foresight to make that happen. I don't know what role he played in having Zope become open source, because Zope had preceded it open source. But yeah, that was very far-sighted.
I was just thinking about, we should probably bring him onto the podcast.
Oh, the Zope founders.
Yes, the Zope people.
Yeah, I mean, what we owe to them is fantastic. I mean, they showed us good Python engineering, among other things.
And developed a whole bunch of things that that Python picked up on.
Oh, yes. And it should have picked up on even more.
Well, you know, maybe I've probably told a lot of people this till they're sick of hearing, but the whole concept of object databases was in the earlier mid 90s was a big thing. And yet, you know, now you look at it, well, there aren't that many in use. And yet ZODB, my gosh, mind blowing.
Yeah, I know people acted like NoSQL was the most fantastic thing to come along, and Zope had been doing it for years. And granular security in an object database. I mean, what we owe to Jim Fulton and Trey Seaver and Chris McDonald, they just did fantastic things.
Now that you've been, I guess, a little bit more removed from the Plone community and the Plone project, I was wondering if you had been thinking about some of the advice that you'd want to give to the current board members about what to do, if there's anything that they could adjust in terms of trying to steer Plone. I mean, you know, the wise man on the mountain has come down a little bit, and we will share a few pearls of wisdom.
Oh, the world of open source software is so rapidly changing that, I mean, one thing to be ready for when you step back is your expertise decays at an unbelievable rate. And it's not just in the hard technology, it's also in the culture. I mean, I know Plone is active and energetic, and I see things going on, but I don't know what the issues are inside the community any longer. I don't know what issues the board is facing. So it's hard to say. I mean, it would be if I said something, it would be as grossly generic as pay attention to the culture.
I think from where I sit, which, you know, I haven't been on the board now for a few years, but I'm still in touch a lot with board members because we're still doing things together to help marketing or the conference. Mm-hmm. And so I see them working so hard to encourage activity and acknowledge the activity and the people who have been contributing to Plone, even very recently, some amazing contributions, and some old companies that have like rejoined and have like doubled down on their contributions, certainly to Valto, for example, and their assistance for World Plone Day, which is coming up, in April. So I think some of the committees that you were part of, like the foundation, the membership committee, and you're showing me the ropes on that and showing me the ropes on the unified installer. And I mean, that whole effort is continuing, and it's great to see.
I am tickled every time I see new members coming on the foundation. I mean, that's such a great sign of health. And, if people are coming back, it's because they trust the culture that was built up. And for good reason.
Well, I can tell you that we're trying to continue what you've done, and your generation of Plonistas and Zapatistas.
Yeah, Zapatistas.
It's Steve. We have great people we need to emulate. We want to continue emulating. You're one of them.
Well, thank you. That's a very flattering thing to say. And as far as I know, you aren't owing me anything at the moment.
All right. Well, with that, I want to thank you, Steve McMahon, long-time Plone board member and Plone community leader. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Kim. It's fantastic seeing you, and hello to your family and everybody else. And wonderful to everybody who's continuing to work on Plone out there. You're not seeing me write in every day, but I know it's happening, and I'm so energized and encouraged by what I see you doing.